What did George Berkeley think of the distinction between primary and secondary qualities?
Seventeenth-century empirical philosophers believed that secondary qualities are what we perceive, namely colors, sounds, textures, and smells. They thought that primary qualities like mass and number were the qualities of atoms that made up objects. We can't perceive primary qualities, but the 17th-century empiricists held that it is the interaction between the primary qualities of atoms that cause our perception of secondary qualities. For example, the atoms in red paint interact with our eyes, through light, to cause the experience of red. But Berkeley denied that there was a distinction between primary and secondary qualities. Because it is impossible to have an idea of a primary quality such as mass, extension, size, or number without also having an idea of its color, texture, or other secondary qualities.
What is a meme?
In The Selfish Gene, 1976, British evolutionary biologist, Professor and author Richard Dawkins coined the term as being on a par with gene. A meme, for instance, a tune, recipe, moral system, or style of dress gets passed on from one generation to the next via cultural interaction. Although memes are not usually held to be physically inherited the way that genes are, social biologists believe them to be subject to natural selection and mutation.
Which counter-Enlightenment figures had lasting effects on philosophy?
Giovanni Battista, Giambattista, Vico, or Vigo, 1668–1744. Has in recent years been rediscovered, or discovered, as an important philosopher. Edmund Burke, 1729–1797, was the most explicit conservative of modern times. Although Joseph Marie de Maistre, 1753–1821, held similar views. Also, Jonathan Swift, 1667–1745, deserves mention as a mordant critic of the establishment in general. And the Marquis de Sade, 1740–1814, represents a kind of extreme marginality in his depravity, which marginality was later taken up by 19th and 20th century progressives. He also remains genuinely outrageous.
What is Aristotle's notion of the unmoved mover?
According to Aristotle, all of nature develops, changes, comes into being, and passes out of being through the operations of the four causes. However, and here Aristotle's metaphysics and philosophy of science take on a theological tone. Not unlike Plato's, causal chains cannot be infinite. So there must be a first cause, something that is not itself caused, an unmoved mover. The unmoved mover that is the cause of everything cannot be an efficient, material, or even a formal cause, because all of those are contained in things that exist. The unmoved mover is the ultimate final cause, that to which everything is aiming. It is the greatest good and the purpose of life. And Aristotle tells us that it is nous or mind, and its essence is thought, which is always active. It thinks about itself, nous contemplating nous.
How was John Duns Scotus' work different from Thomas Aquinas?
John Duns Scotus, 1266–1308, was not opposed to Aquinas, 1224–1274, but he brought St. Augustine's, 354–430, thought into philosophical and theological conversations that were largely dominated by interest in Aristotle. Duns Scotus also drew on Avicenna's, c. 980–1037, notion of unified being in his idea of God as infinite being, who had appeared to Moses as I am who am. Duns Scotus lectured at Oxford, Paris, and Cologne, where he taught that God had created each individual being with a unique nature or hekiide. Duns Scotus thought it was the will and not the intellect that is rational, because the will can will either one thing or its opposite. The will has both an intellectual appetite for happiness and self-actualization, and a desire to love things based on their inherent value. These aspects of the will incline us to love God for our own good and also because He is God. Duns Scotus introduced a new idea of intellectual intuition, a kind of awareness that enables us to be certain of our own thoughts, and in the afterlife, be in the direct presence of God.
What was Robert Nozick's own political theory?
Nozick, 1938–2002, held that any form of distribution is just if those involved are entitled to what they own. Entitlements concern acquisition and transfer of property, as well as the rectification of prior wrongs and errors. He favored a minimal state that served a policing function, and defended strong private property rights for its citizens. Although when analyzing John Locke's, 1632–1704, idea that private property is based on mixing labor with something, he posed this question: why does mixing one's labor with something make one the owner of it? If I own a can of tomato juice and spill it in the sea, do I thereby own the sea, or have I foolishly dissipated my tomato juice? Nozick resolved this puzzle by moving from a metaphysical ground to a utilitarian one, the same way Locke did. We are entitled to what we mix our labor with because the added labor increases the value of the original material.
What was Princess Elizabeth's philosophical influence on René Descartes?
Descartes wrote Passions of Soul mainly to try to answer her questions about how the mind interacted with the body. In that book, Descartes discusses how emotions are the mind's perceptions of disturbances in our bodies. He thought that the will was part of the soul and immaterial, but that there were very delicate fluids in the pineal gland that the will could influence. The result was that parts of the body could be controlled by the mind. In this passage, the possibility of the materiality of the soul is deftly introduced in a way that illumines Descartes' dualism. No one, including Descartes, could satisfactorily explain how an immaterial soul could interact with a material body. One solution to this problem that Elizabeth intuited was to posit the soul as material.
How did the Islamic religion begin?
The Prophet Muhammad, 570 to 632, who was born in Saudi Arabia and died in Medina, was the founder of Islam. At the age of 40, he experienced an epiphany in which the angel Gabriel appeared to him while he was meditating. Until he was 60, he experienced continuing revelations that identified him as the culmination of a tradition of prophets from Abraham in the Old Testament, or Hebrew Bible, down to Jesus of Nazareth in the New Testament. His transcription of his revelations were the basis of the Quran, or Quran, the Bible of Islam. Muhammad had a divine mandate to spread the new religion. Within the first 100 years of Islam, jihad, or holy war, reached into France, where Charles the Sledgehammer defeated the Muslims at Tours. In Spain, the Moors built luscious gardens and beautiful buildings, chief among which were the magnificent libraries in Córdoba, Granada, Seville, and Toledo. The Muslim cultural influence is still evident in Spanish architecture to this day.
What are some details of David Hume's life and career?
Hume was born in Edinburgh in 1711. His father was a distant relative of the Earl of Home, and his mother's close relatives were lawyers. David was expected to study law, but he didn't like it and left Edinburgh University when he was 15 to read and think about philosophy. He subjected himself to years of intense study, and in 1734 was under a doctor's care for ailments of body and spirit. This was followed by a philosophical breakthrough, as well as work for a merchant in Bristol. He then spent 3 years at La Flèche, René Descartes, 1596 to 1650, Old School. Hume anonymously published a treatise of human nature in 1739. This work was ignored by other intellectuals, and Hume himself later described it as having fallen stillborn from the press. In hopes of greater recognition, Hume was consumed by what he called love of literary fame. He composed an abstract of a treatise of human nature, which was anonymously published in 1740. His next major philosophical work was Philosophical Essays Concerning the Human Understanding. 1748, which was retitled An Inquiry Concerning the Human Understanding, 1758. Then came An Inquiry Concerning the Principles of Morals, 1751. The inquiry was more explicitly anti-religious than the treatise. His Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion was probably written during the 1750s. Although published posthumously. With his philosophical research complete, Hume applied himself to history. His History of Great Britain won him great fame and acclaim, economics, ethics, and political philosophy. However, he also tried, although without success, to secure the position of Chair of Philosophy at the Universities of Edinburgh and Glasgow. He was appointed Secretary to General St. Clare for 3 years in 1746, which led him to Brittany and Turin. And he was in charge of the Advocates' Library in Edinburgh for 5 years. Beginning in 1752. He was then private secretary to the British ambassador in Paris and Under-Secretary of State.
What is Native American philosophy?
Native American tribes and nations have held well-developed worldviews, religions, epistemologies, metaphysics, and social and political views long before Europeans invaded and appropriated their lands. Much of this knowledge was transmitted orally and subject to loss and fragmentation. Following what many indigenous people call the Native American Holocaust, the development of Native American philosophy as a subfield in academic philosophy requires not just reconstruction of past knowledge but some acceptance of the methods of Western philosophy. The problem is that these methods are highly problematic for most indigenous thinkers. Furthermore, after centuries of distorted descriptions of their cultures by anthropologists and government officials, most Native American philosophers have a strong preference for speaking in their own voices, rather than agreeing to let others present their perspectives. There are not very many Native Americans in U.S. university philosophy departments at this time, perhaps fewer than 50. Nevertheless, since the 1980s a canon of Native American philosophy has developed, which includes the following sources: The Sacred Hoop by Paula Gunn Allen, 1986, How It Is, The Native American Philosophy of V. F. Cordova by Linda Hogan, by Kathleen Dean Moore, Kurt Peters, and Ted Jojoba, 2007, Cultural Sites of Critical Insight, Philosophy, Aesthetics, and African American and Native American Women's Writings, by Angela L. Cotton and Krista Davis, 2007, American Indian Thought, Philosophical Essays, by N. Waters, 2003. And Defending Mother Earth, Native American Perspectives on Environmental Justice, by Jace Weaver, 1996.
Were Pyrrhonic skeptics anxious about the impossibility of knowledge?
No. Pyrrhonic skeptics were reluctant to commit themselves on either opposing side of an issue and instead cultivated ataraxia, a mental state of peace and quiet. Pyrrhonic skepticism was supposed to be a cure for the disease of dogmatism, in which positions on truths that were not evident were taken up and defended, causing distress. 3rd century Pyrrhonists organized this process into sets of 2, 5, or 10 tropes, each one of which suggested how to suspend judgments about matters that went beyond appearances.
What are some other interesting facts about A. J. Ayer's life and career?
Ayer was a prominent subject of academic gossip for his womanizing. He was married 4 times, and for his engagement in fashionable popular culture. There was an overall glamour to his life. Ayer's mother's family founded the French Citroën car company, and his father worked for the wealthy Rothschild family of bankers. He attended Eton, won a scholarship to Oxford, and served in the Special Operations Executive, during World War II. Before the war, while on a visit to New York, Ayer made a record with actress Lauren Bacall. He supported the Tottenham Hotspur Football Club and was known to its fans as the Prof. Ayer was also a secular humanist. He was honorary associate of the Rationalist Press Association after 1947, and a successor to evolutionary biologist and humanist Julian Huxley when he became president of the British Humanist Association. In 1965, Ayer was named the first president of the Agnostics Adoption Society. He edited the anthology The Humanist Outlook in 1965. At the peak of his career, Ayer served as a sort of in-house atheist for the British Broadcasting Corporation. He debated the Jesuit philosopher Frederick Copleston, 1907 to 1994, on the subject of religion. Copleston was the author of the 9-volume History of Philosophy, 1946 to 1975, so the two were matched in erudition. Ayer, apparently briefly, revised his lifelong atheism after a near-death experience in 1989 brought on by choking on a piece of smoked salmon. Toward the end of his life, though, he said, "What I should have said is that my experiences have weakened. Not my belief that there is no life after death, but my inflexible attitude towards that belief."
What is experimental philosophy?
It is a very new philosophical approach that aims to use empirical information to back up the ordinary intuitions to which philosophers refer. People are given philosophical problems or solutions to them and asked if they agree with the philosopher's answer. Experimental philosophy has been applied to philosophy of language, philosophy of action, and intuitions that free will is not compatible with determinism.
What was the Native American philosophical tradition?
There are as many Native American philosophies as there are distinct nations and tribes. Over most of its history, their philosophies were transmitted orally from one generation to the next. As American indigenous cultures and tribes were destroyed by war and the loss of ancestral lands, these transmissions were largely lost. Some transmissions were recorded by early anthropologists in condescending ways that distorted them. There are contemporary attempts to reconstitute Native American traditional oral knowledge as critiques of Western philosophy, religion, technology, and economics. Such critiques now form the content of Native American or Indigenous American studies, as well as the late 20th century philosophical subfield of Native American philosophy. However, the speeches of 18th and 19th century Native American leaders, who sought to resist removal to reservations and preserve the lives, cultures, and lands of their peoples, endure as unreconstituted early American philosophy. Noteworthy in this regard is T.D. Uskin, who, when he spoke at treaty councils in Pennsylvania, began, "I desire all that I have said, may be taken down aright." T.D. Uskin. Tenskwatawa, and Sagowatha spoke like Americans.
What was Hobbes' idea of the social contract?
The social contract was Hobbes' solution to the unpleasantness of life in the state of nature. It was an agreement among citizens to give up their individual powers to harm one another and transfer all of those powers to the sovereign, or Leviathan. In return, the sovereign would keep order, which would enable all the benefits of civilized life, such as a just legal system, education, marriage, security in property, and a flourishing of the arts and sciences. Hobbes' Leviathan, though, was to have totalitarian powers over his subjects, including the right over their lives, censorship, the right to draft them into military service, and to impose any other necessary burden of government. The only rights retained by subjects were the rights to preserve themselves and resist imprisonment or execution. Laws were literally the commands of the sovereign. Once the sovereign was made the irrevocable gift of power from the people, the only thing that could bring down the government would be its self-abdication or defeat by foreign enemies.
What were some of John Stuart Mill's achievements?
Mill's father's interests and connections set the direction for his son. although Mill ultimately chose his own path based on life experience and the influence of his wife. Mill's father, James, was a philosopher and economist, as well as an official in the East India Company. J.S. Mill also worked in that company until he retired when the British government took over the company's administration in India in 1857. Mill edited the Westminster Review in the 1830s and was a member of Parliament between 1865 and 1868. Overall, Mill was dedicated to getting the educated public of Great Britain to accept scientific solutions to political, social, and economic problems. Although he also placed great value on humanistic concerns as informed by the arts and life itself.
Who was William Whewell?
William Whewell, 1794 to 1866, was a polymath who contributed work to mechanics, mineralogy, geology, astronomy, political economy, theology, education, law, architecture, ethics, the philosophy of science, and what he named ideology. He was a founder and president of the British Association for the Advancement of Science, and a Fellow of the Royal Society. Whewell invented the term scientist analogously with artist. He was the most influential figure in British education in the 19th century.
Who was Thomas Hobbes?
More than any other 17th-century philosopher, Thomas Hobbes, 1588 to 1679, directly applied the atomism and materialism of the science of his day to metaphysics. Hobbes believed that everything in existence was caused by matter and motion. He was one of René Descartes, 1596 to 1650, early critics and was considered an atheist by his peers. Hobbes is most famous for his description of the natural condition of mankind as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short.
Who was Leibniz?
Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz, 1646 to 1715, was a German philosopher, scientist, mathematician, and historian famous for his metaphysical idealism as well as his epistemological rationalism. In addition, he made contributions to the fields of astronomy, biology, including embryology, engineering, information technology, law, logic, medicine, paleontology, philology, sinology, social science, and topology. The calculating machine he invented could add, subtract, and calculate square roots. His plans for invading Egypt are said to have been used by Napoleon. Leibniz also kept up a voluminous correspondence throughout his life.
What was dogmatism?
Dogmatism, then and now, was the position that there is at least one true thing about the world that we can know with absolute certainty.
When did women philosophers first start to become recognized as part of philosophy?
Beginning in the early Christian era, the scholarly work and educational activities of at least some women philosophers were recognized. And some male philosophers made special efforts to interact with them intellectually.
Who was Bernard Bosanquet?
Bernard Bosanquet, 1848 to 1923, was an English Hegelian who taught at University College. From 1870 to 1881, and at St. Andrews, from 1903 to 1908, Oxford. His name was inherited from French Huguenot forebears. He left Oxford when an inheritance enabled him to pursue social activist causes in London. His major works appear as the published editions of the Gifford Lectures that he gave in 1911 and 1912, The Principle of Individuality and Value, 1912, and The Value and Destiny of the Individual, 1913. Bosanquet explained the existence of the Absolute with his own system of logical doctrines. He advocated for community values as opposed to individualism. And he was the leading British philosopher of aesthetics in his day and beyond.
What was or is natural law?
Natural law, or the law of nature, is a set of rules for human actions, usually posited as having a divine source. As a universal moral and political code, natural law was first conceptualized by Stoic philosophers, who believed that natural law was part of the fundamental structure of the universe. Some early thinkers believed that natural law applied to animals as well as humans. Christian theorists later took up the idea of natural law as self-evident principles of human behavior that could be known only by rational beings. Thomas Aquinas, c. 1225–1274, thought that human reason could reveal God's intentions for how we ought always to conduct ourselves so as to preserve the common good, or the good of the community. Following natural law is an important part of obedience to God. The particular laws of nations and peoples might differ, but the basic principles of natural law are universal.
Why do Locke's biographers consider his last years happy ones?
After a life of moving from one place to another, when Locke's health began to fail in the early 1690s, he moved into the home of Damaris Cudworth, who had become Lady Masham. Biographers think it probable that he had been close to proposing to her decades earlier. When Locke joined the Masham household, he was on friendly terms with Sir Francis Masham, Damara's husband. And he insisted on paying £1 weekly rent, although he would have been welcome as a guest. He brought with him his personal library of 5,000 books and his personal effects, all of which were inventoried on a list that Lady Masham signed, a regular practice for Locke, whenever he moved. The country air at Oates, in Essex, was better for his lungs than London had been, and he was able to continue his writing, receive visitors, and keep up his correspondence until he died. This arrangement, however, was not without its detractors. John Edwards, who believed that Locke's Reasonableness of Christianity was a subversive and even atheistic work, referred to Locke as the governor of the Seraglio brothel at Oates.
What world facts inform postmodernism?
The term postmodern came from the field of architecture. Meaning after modern, it is a phrase that connotes, sometimes ironically, borrowing from the past in irreverent ways. Postmodern philosophy arose after major historical changes, the different scientific worldviews, represented by Albert Einstein's theories of relativity and subatomic physics. The enormous destructive power of 20th century warfare, the liberation of former colonies, as well as women and non-whites in Europe and the United States, the economic, political, and social conditions of post-colonialism, and a breakdown in traditional social institutions such as the nuclear family. Changes in women's roles, global capitalism, new economic inequalities, and environmental crises.
For what is Heraclitus still famous?
Heraclitus is the author of the saying, "You cannot step into the same river twice." He meant that human life and circumstances are in constant flux, like a river.
Who was Princess Elizabeth?
This royal friend and student of Descartes was a powerful woman with an independent mind. Elizabeth, elect res Palatine and Queen of Bohemia, 1596 to 1662. Was the oldest daughter of James VI of Scotland and Anne of Denmark, his queen consort. Her descendants, the Hanoverians, were to occupy the British throne. In 1613 she married Frederick V, the Elector of the Palatine, an alliance designed to strengthen her father's ties to the Holy Roman Empire. Her husband was only briefly King of Bohemia, however, and after his exile, they lived in The Hague. In 1649, she entered a convent in Hertford in Westphalia, in what is now Germany, which she managed until her death. Elizabeth's interest in philosophy had a depth that was unusual for someone with her social and familial obligations. In 1643, she wrote Descartes, and I admit it would be easier for me to concede matter and extension to the soul than the capacity of moving a body and a being moved, to an immaterial being. For, if the first occurred through information, the spirits that perform the movement would have to be intelligent, which you accord to nothing corporeal. And although in your metaphysical meditations you show the possibility of the second, it is, however, very difficult to comprehend that a soul, as you have described it, after having had the faculty and habit of reasoning well, can lose all of it on account of some vapors, and that, although it can subsist without the body and has nothing in common with it, is yet so ruled by it.
What was Jean-Paul Sartre's basis for his idea of freedom?
Sartre argued that freedom was inherent in the very structure of human consciousness. To be conscious is to be free. Consciousness has no prior cause but is a spontaneous upsurge. Consciousness is nothing in itself, because it is always aware of something other than itself. Consciousness is freedom. Thus, consciousness is not a thing in itself. Sartre called consciousness the for itself, or pour soi, and everything else is the in itself, or en soi. At first glance, his division of the human cosmos into for itself and in itself resembles René Descartes' 1596–1650, doctrine of mental and physical substance. But Sartre went beyond Descartes' idea of the mental substance. For Sartre, as his hero in Nausea, 1938, discovers in the course of a research project, even a person's past meritorious acts or traits of character have the status of en soi. It is a form of bad faith. For example, to pretend that one is determined to fulfill his or her duty because that is how he or she was raised, or that one's laziness makes disciplined work impossible. People are responsible for allowing their own background, weaknesses, or strengths to be motives for action in the immediate present.
What did Thomas Reid believe about free will?
Reid believed that we are able to will something because we have a conception of the action and we will to do that thing. Concerning freedom, Reid thought it was not sufficient, as David Hume, 1711–1776, had claimed, that we act according to our will, but that we must also have the power to choose what to will. This is because willing is instrumental to the goal of an action. And without the power over means there is no power over the end. Your free actions are those caused by you and you know that you are their cause. Because your conviction of your freedom arises from your faculties, as a first principle.
What were Bentham's life and career like?
Bentham was born in Houndsditch, London. and began studies at Queen's College, Oxford, when he was just 12 years old. After his graduation, he entered Lincoln's Inn to become a lawyer and was called to the bar in 1767. He never practiced law, though, instead dedicating himself to reforming the entire system of civil and criminal law. Existing legal theory seemed incoherent, he felt, and the penal system was cruel and very expensive to administrate. Bentham's legal writings began with work on legal reform that was not published until 1811. And his comment on Blackstone's commentaries was not published until 1928. Bentham wrote voluminously, but there was a certain disorganization in his methods of completing any one thing. He published part of his Blackstone criticism as a fragment on government. 1776, An Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation, 1789. Bentham attempted to gain Catherine the Great of Russia's support for his constitutional code. He was made a citizen of France after the Revolution. In 1792, and his ideas also reached the United States. But he was most influential politically in England, where he was leader of the philosophical radicals and an inspiration to the Benthamites. Both of these groups thought that Bentham's pleasure principle or principle of utility could be used to change the world for the better. James Mill, father of John Stuart Mill, 1806 to 1873. The great 19th-century English utilitarian, was a close friend of his. Bentham also founded the journal Westminster Review, as well as University College.
In what ways did William Whewell disagree with Immanuel Kant?
Whewell disagreed with Kant, 1724 to 1804, in not limiting the number of fundamental ideas, and claiming that we can have objective knowledge of the world as it exists in itself, independently of our fundamental ideas. Kant, on the other hand, held that we cannot know things as they are in themselves, but only things as our categories enable us to understand them. Whewell posited God as the creator of our fundamental ideas. Because God had created them, these ideas matched reality.
What was Alexius Mening's psychological theory?
Mening divided mental experience into act, content, and object. He worked on the basis of Brentano's theory of intentionality, whereby all mental states intend objects. The mental act, or act element, is the way that the subject is directed toward the object, whereas the specific content, or content element, is its focus in that case. For example, it is a different act to think of an apple versus to desire an apple. Thinking of an apple and thinking of a car is a difference in content. And going from one to the other is a change in focus. Meinung's object theory bypassed traditional ontology because as intended objects. In the sense of Franz Brentano 1837–1917, it was not necessary that all objects exist. In fact, Meinung stressed a bias toward existence in the history of metaphysics, which he called a prejudice in favor of the actual. Each object has a socion, or character, which is given through its nuclear features. Because objects truly possess their characters, even statements about non-existent objects can be true. Because how objects are is independent of their existence. For example, a pink unicorn is genuinely pink, even though unicorns do not exist.
What was an essay in defense of the female sex?
In an essay in defense of the female sex, the usurpation of man, and the tyranny of custom. Here in England, especially, 1696, marriage was directly attacked. John Locke's, 1632–1704, empiricist epistemology was put to use. In a search for social causes of the inequality between the sexes. The writer did not argue that women were as good as men, claiming that they were actually better on account of their intellectual superiority, which resulted from differences in nature.
What was Arthur Schopenhauer's influence?
Schopenhauer's philosophical ideas influenced Friedrich Nietzsche, 1844–1900. And his idea of an unconscious will was formative for Sigmund Freud's, 1856–1939, ideas of psychology. Schopenhauer had profound effects in literature and was the first significant Western philosopher to incorporate Eastern thought in his system.
Who was Voltaire?
Voltaire was the pen name of François-Marie Arouet, 1694–1778. A playwright, poet, essayist, and widely read popularizer of Sir Isaac Newton. His Philosophical Letters, 1734, and Philosophical Dictionary, 1764. Both express his brilliant wit and underlying sense of social justice. He made great fun of Gottfried Leibniz, 1646–1716, as Dr. Pangloss in the satire Candide, but although he thought that this was not the best of all possible worlds. As Pangloss did, he believed improvement was possible on specific issues. Voltaire's empiricism was similar to that of John Locke, 1632–1704. In that he was a moderate skeptic who also thought that human knowledge is generally adequate for the lives most people lead. In other words, we know what we need to know. He argued for toleration and objected to the narrowness of church Christianity. By the same token, he did not go as far as Jean-Jacques Rousseau. 1712 to 1778, in extolling simplicity over civilization. He replied to Rousseau after he gave him a copy of the social contract. I have received your new book against the human race, and thank you for it. Never was such a cleverness used in the design of making us all stupid. One longs, in reading your book, to walk on all fours. But as I have lost that habit for more than 60 years, I feel unhappily the impossibility of resuming it.
How did Mary Estelle's life affect her written work?
Estelle was unmarried and spent much of her adult life in a community of women with similar backgrounds in London. She is famous for having said, "The whole world is a single ladies' family." But she never openly condemned the subordination of women in marriage because she herself believed in charitable service and the unselfish roles of women in family life. Her main objection to the nature of marriage at her time was that men chose wives mainly for material gain or temporary sexual passion. She wanted husbands and wives to have a bond of friendship.
What are the major works of Thomas Aquinas?
Aquinas, 1224 to 1274, wrote prodigiously throughout his life. And his works include commentaries on the writings of Aristotle, reports on Albertus Magnus. 1200 to 1280, lectures, a commentary on the sentences of Peter Lombard, c. 1095 to 1160, and other philosophical treatises such as On Being and Essence and on the Principles of Nature, as well as on the unity of the intellect against the Averroists. He is most famous for his Summa against the Gentiles and Summa on Theology.
How was George Berkeley's occasionalism distinctive?
Most occasionalists thought that the real causal connections between things took place in God's mind. Berkeley did not hold that view. According to Berkeley, we have ideas of sensory phenomena that are regularly followed by other specific ideas of sensory phenomena. But the idea of a causal link between them is an illusion.
Who was Claude Lévi-Strauss?
Claude Lévi-Strauss, 1908, is a French social anthropologist who is best known for The Elementary Structures of Kinship, 1949, and The Savage Mind, 1962. He applied Saussurian ideas of the system of language to social structures, analyzing human relations and systems of exchange, particularly in kinship relations.
For what is Luce Irigaray most famous?
The publication of Irigaray's, 1932, doctoral thesis, Speculum of the Other Woman. 1974, led to her expulsion from further study at Lacan's Freudian school at Vincennes. In Europe, a PhD is not sufficient for university teaching. As it is in the United States, and a second dissertation or habilitation is required. Irigaray's dissertation consisted of her theoretical analyses of a lecture by Sigmund Freud. 1856 to 1939, on femininity, and long quotations from the works of male philosophers, from Plato. C. 428 c. 348 BCE, to Hegel, 1770 to 1831. It was evident in the work that by a speculum she was referring to the concave mirrored medical instrument inserted into a woman's body.
Who was Edith Stein?
Edith Stein, 1891 to 1942, was canonized by Pope John Paul II in 1998 as Saint Teresa Benedicta of the Cross. She was born into an observant Jewish family in the Central European region of Silesia, which was then part of the German Empire. In 1932 she denounced the Nazi regime to Pope Pius XI. She converted to Roman Catholicism in 1922 and was received into the Discalced Carmelite order in 1934 in a retaliatory move against Jewish converts in the Netherlands, where the Carmelites had sent Stein for safety. She and her sister Rosa were transported to the Auschwitz concentration camp. They died there in the gas chamber in 1942. Stein was a student of Edmund Husserl, 1859 to 1938. First at Göttingen University and then at Freiburg, where she became his assistant. Her doctorate was on the problem of empathy. She became a faculty member at Freiburg University after working with Martin Heidegger in preparing Husserl's manuscripts for publication. As a Jewish woman, she was barred from further postgraduate studies at Freiburg and other German universities. She finally gave up her assistantship to Husserl and began to teach in Catholic girls' schools. Learning about Thomas Aquinas, c. 1225 to 1274, and Catholic philosophy in general. She did become a lecturer at the Institute for Pedagogy at Munster, but had to give it up due to anti-Semitic laws in 1933, the same year that her former colleague Martin Heidegger, 1889 to 1976, was made rector of Freiburg University. The miracle Edith Stein is supposed to have performed that of curing a child who had overdosed on acetaminophen in response to a prayer from relatives is disputed by some Jewish groups who claim it is not clear whether she is a genuine martyr. Her legacy includes numerous writings, some of which were translated into English in the 1980s and 1990s. Life in a Jewish Family, her unfinished autobiographical account, 1986. On the Problem of Empathy, 1989, Essays on Women, 1996, and The Hidden Life, 1993. Stein also wrote Knowledge and Faith, Finite and Eternal Being. An Attempt to an Ascent to the Meaning of Being, Philosophy of Psychology and the Humanities. Self-Portrait in Letters, which have not yet been translated into English or published.
How did Pyrrhonic skepticism get its name?
It was named after Pyrrho of Elis, 360 to 270 B. CE, who thought that knowledge was impossible.
Why is George Berkeley considered either an aberration or an obstacle?
Berkeley is an aberration insofar as his ideas defy common sense to the point of being dismissible as simple absurdities. He is an obstacle insofar as he founded a powerful and enduring school of thought that dominated some areas of philosophy in the 19th century and evolved into very perplexing progressive movements in the 20th and, it now seems, 21st centuries.
How can this be?
Freya's explanation was that there is a difference between sense and reference. Reference is the actual planet Venus, in this case. But sense is how the planet is referred to by the term morning star, i.e., a bright object in the eastern sky before sunrise. Thus, the morning star does not stand for Venus itself, but for the sense of how Venus is presented. This is why the two sentences that appear to be equivalent really are different. It explains why it is not informative to say that Venus is Venus or that the morning star is the morning star. But it is informative to say that Venus is the morning star.
What was Jean-Paul Sartre's version of existentialism?
Sartre was an atheist. So he began with the premise that man is alone in the world and there is no higher power. There is no fixed human nature because man is the inventor of the very idea of nature, man makes himself. This ability to make oneself is accompanied by a responsibility for what one makes. And it leads to considerable anguish because one must choose what to be on one's own. The living human being is always in a situation of varying degrees of difficulty from which there is no escape. Others are also present in one's life, of course, and they have the same kind of freedoms you do, which renders cooperative and lastingly loving human relationships extremely difficult. One can never fully see the other as he or she is to himself or herself. Because others are in the same situation, the net effect is that hell is other people. Sartre's view of intimate relationships was bleak because The person desired always eludes being the object desired. The desired person can never fully become an object because he or she has their own freedom. To accept one's freedom and one's situation, or facticity, are both necessary in order to be in good faith. The person who lives in bad faith either denies his own freedom and responsibility or denies the reality of his situation. Everything is chosen, even emotions that carry one to extremes, or insanity. Even the most difficult situation, which one has not chosen, does not negate one's freedom. It is the individual who gives the situation the meaning it has for him or her as a difficult situation. With a gun to one's head, for instance, one still has the choice of whether or not to live.
How did Henri Bergson relate real time to free will?
Real time, according to Bergson, cannot be imagined as points on a line in space, like scientific clock time. Real time is intuited directly and within us, it is the ground of spontaneous free acts. Our free will is our spontaneous free acts, which are unpredictable. Intuition and analysis parallel this distinction. Intuition apprehends duration directly and examines it, whereas analysis breaks duration up into unchanging concepts.
Did Sigmund Freud analyze himself?
Yes, he did, and several examples show that he aimed for complete disclosure. On his own Oedipus complex, he wrote, "A friend, I have found, in my own case too. The phenomenon of being in love with my mother and jealous of my father, and I now consider it a universal event in early childhood. Even if not so early as in children who have been made hysterical." He was also just as willing to analyze literary characters and authorship. Thus, he famously wrote about Shakespeare's Hamlet. "Fleetingly the thought passed through my head that the same thing might be at the bottom of Hamlet as well. I am not thinking of Shakespeare's conscious intention, but believe, rather, that a real event stimulated the poet to his representation, in that his unconscious understood the unconscious of his hero." Freud also collected his own memory lapses, slips of the tongue, and dreams for analysis. In the 1936 article "A Disturbance of Memory on the Acropolis," he explained why he felt doubtful and uneasy when he visited the Acropolis in Greece in 1904, "It must be that a sense of guilt was attached to the satisfaction in having gone such a long way. There was something about it that was wrong, that from earliest times had been forbidden. It was something to do with a child's criticism of his father, with the undervaluation which took the place of the overvaluation of earlier childhood. It seems as though the essence of success was to have got further than one's father, and as though to excel one's father was still something forbidden. Freud's father had been too poor to make such a trip, and not educated enough to have been interested in the Acropolis.
What is the problem of universals?
The problem of universals, as addressed by Boethius, 480 c. 525, has to do with what makes a kind of thing distinct from other things. Take, for example, the domestic dog. Dogs have the greatest genetic variety of any living species. Scientists can now identify every one of them as dogs, from Chihuahuas to Great Danes. In principle, that is, they don't actually do this, by their DNA, which has certain predetermined resemblances to earlier lines of canines. However, well before the discovery of genes and DNA, human beings could both identify any particular animal that was a dog as a dog, even though that dog had a unique appearance and personality. What is true of dogs in this sense is true of all natural species. All of their members seem to share something. Plato would have said that a dog's essence is a copy of an ideal form of dog, in which all dogs participate. Aristotle would have said that there is an essence of dogness, which can be known to human beings and which is shared by all dogs, but that the dog essence is in each dog and only abstracted by the mind. Strictly speaking, for Aristotle there does not exist a dog essence apart from Rover, Jake, Lacey, Mirabelle, or any other name that designates a unique animal. The problem of universals is the question of whether Plato or Aristotle was correct. Philosophers have agonized over this question and burnt many candles, oil lamps, and computers in the process. Those who think that the essences in individual things are real have been called realists. Those who think that essences are abstractions or creations of the human mind have been called nominalists.
Who was Martin Heidegger?
Martin Heidegger, 1889 to 1976, was the phenomenological ontologist who first united existentialism with phenomenology, but later revealed that his true concern was ontology. He is considered one of the titans of Western philosophy and had more direct enduring influence over 20th century continental philosophy than any other thinker. Heidegger wrote extensively on the history of philosophy, developing his own phenomenological analyses. His main books include his doctoral dissertation The Doctrine of Judgment in Psychologism, 1914, his habilitation, in Europe, Ph.D. Right, 2 dissertations. One to get a degree as a scholar and the second to qualify them to teach on a university level. The Doctrine of Categories and Signification in Duns Scotus, 1914, his most famous being And Time, 1927. And then Introduction to Metaphysics, 1953, What is Called Thinking, 1954, What is Philosophy? 1956, On the Way to Language, 1959, Nietzsche I and II, 1961, and Phenomenology and Theology, 1970. Transcripts of Heidegger's lectures were partly published in 1975, the complete works would constitute over 100 volumes. Heidegger is also known for articles on art and poetry, as well as his essay The Question Concerning Technology.